The Supreme Court justices recently asked Congress for more money for private security. The Democratic Socialists of America want to eliminate the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the presidency. And the Fort Worth, Texas police officers have to eat crow after constitutional violations. Thanks for joining me. I'm Keisha Derry, constitutional lawyer and believer of Jesus Christ. So Justices Amy Coney Barrett and Elena Kagan recently testified in front of Congress about the need for a higher budget because they need more security. Let's listen to what Justice Barrett had to say.
Abstract, but being on the receiving end of them is not. So I thought I would just share a little bit about how the threats have affected me and my family personally. They have required me to, my children, to think about and see things that children should not have to see or think about. One example is when threats to my life were particularly intense a few years ago around the time of the Dobbs leak. My security detail sent me home with a bulletproof vest, and I carried it into my house, put it into my bedroom, dropped it down on a table, turned around, and my 12-year-old son was standing in the doorway of my bedroom, and he wanted to know what it was and why I had it, and I didn't know how to respond because maybe I lack imagination, but I didn't expect that performing this service was going to put me in the position of explaining to my children what a bulletproof vest was and why I had to wear one. It's also been reported in the news that roughly 6 weeks ago, I was the victim of a swatting incident. At that point, my teenage son, one of my teenage sons, opened the door to go out with friends and saw in our street, it was full of police cars who had responded to a false report of gunshots and raised voices in my home. I was very, very grateful that I had Supreme Court police outside my home because they were able to stop and meet with and explain to the county police that it had been a false alarm, and so the police did not actually attempt to enter our home.
All right. Well, that is very sad, but it's not surprising. We know after the Dobbs leak, there was a lot of consternation about that decision, but that's not the only reason. A lot of the Supreme Court justices, particularly the conservatives, have faced a lot of backlash. Not long ago, Justice Brett Kavanaugh was targeted. His perpetrator went to his house and he had a plot to kill the justice, and he is now in prison because of that. So we know that these threats are very real, and a lot of them come because people cannot tolerate dissent. Remember, none of these people know these justices. They are reacting to decisions that they don't like. They're reacting to opinions that they don't like. And ultimately, that has become a trend in politics for a very long time. I actually did a lot of interviews on Fox News and other networks about Justice Barrett's nomination to the Supreme Court a couple years ago. And you can find those interviews under my maiden name, Keisha Russell. I talked about, her credentials. I think there were a lot of people, a lot of Democrats who are trying to say she was not qualified, which is pretty ridiculous. She is a very intelligent person, although I don't always even agree with her decisions, even though I'm also a conservative. But, there were these ridiculous criticisms about her because she adopted Black children, and people were trying to say that was somehow a bad thing and calling her a colonizer. And it's like, look, if you are criticizing someone for adopting children, then you've got no criticism of someone. It's just ridiculous. And unfortunately, it goes past just the criticism, the threats and having to wear a bulletproof vest. I clerked for an amazing judge on the federal appellate court, and he would say that pressure is a privilege. That means sometimes when you are in a privileged position, when you have an amazing job like being a justice on the Supreme Court, you have to know that you're going to take some arrows sometimes. But this is way beyond that. You're serving the Republic. There's no reason why you should be subject to threats on your life because people don't like that you're conservative or they don't like that you ruled a certain way in a Supreme Court decision. That's insane. A little criticism is fine, but having to wear a bulletproof vest, that's different. These people can do anything they want with their lives. They're serving the Republic out of a duty. And ultimately, many of these people, if they left and went into the private sector, could be millionaires many times over, and they can make far more than they're making now, certainly. So, it's a very sad situation. I testified in the Senate Judiciary Committee during the nomination confirmation hearings for Ketanji Brown Jackson, who I was not a fan of because of her liberal positions, particularly about race, about really just the basics of the Constitution and how it should be applied. Because when you have a lot of radical beliefs, you don't trust the Constitution. That's just the bottom line. And as a reminder, every lawyer takes an oath to defend and protect the Constitution of the United States of America. So if you don't believe that, you probably shouldn't be practicing law, and you definitely shouldn't be a judge, and certainly not a judge on the Supreme Court. But I received a lot of backlash because of that testimony. And it did teach me a lot about how far we are as a society, that we can't take a little criticism. We don't like when people don't agree with us, and we're willing to threaten them and belittle and demean them, and in some cases try to take their lives because we don't like them. So unfortunately, dissent is punished in America in a way that is just very un-American. This is not what this country is about. We're supposed to be about free speech. And the way we have structured our system and our government is how we're able to keep it. This is why America is so unique. But I want to talk about the Democratic Socialists of America, because they have a plan right now to eliminate the Supreme Court, the Senate, and the presidency. Let's look at a clip from a member.
Part of what you said, for example, let's start with abolishing the Senate. The Senate is a very undemocratic institution. I talked a bit about democracy, small d democracy, and that's really important to us. We want democratic representation of all people who live in this country. So the Senate represents, it's 2 senators per state, and it's very undemocratic at a basic level, because a state with a small population has the same representation as a state that has 500,000 people gets the same representation as a state that has 40 million people, like California does, or New York State, or Texas, or Florida, which are the most populated states in the country, but they have the same representation as a much smaller population. So we do believe that government should be proportional to the population, and that's a very basic core principle. So the House of Representatives is more democratic that way. And we just don't see the point of the Senate. Historically, it was meant to serve very wealthy people who owned a lot of land. And that's still a system that we have today. And it's something we would change. We would expand what the House of Representatives does. And
all right, I'm just gonna stop right there. There's so much wrong with what he's saying, because he said he wants everyone to be represented, but then he says that the states that have the most, population, they should be the ones pretty much ruling the roost. And that's exactly why the Senate exists. The House of Representatives is meant to represent, population, provide representation in that matter. But the Senate is designed to ensure that every state is represented equally when it comes to, legislation and things like that everyone has an equal say. So what he's saying really doesn't make any sense, because if you are someone who lives in North Dakota, why is it that your voice doesn't count just because you don't live on the shores of California? So that's ridiculous. But I also want to show you the website for the Democratic Socialists of America. And I want you to see exactly what they believe and what they want to do. So if you look here, okay, you see that one of the things they say is we want to replace the president and Supreme Court with an executive and judiciary chosen by and subordinate to Congress. Okay, first of all, that's not democracy. All right, the reason why we have 3 branches of government in the first place is because we are trying to divide power. The more power you put into Congress, the less power everyone else has. That means the more power that's in Congress, you don't have a president, you don't have a Supreme Court, and there's no division of power. And that is what makes America so great, because you cannot put all of the power in one division of government and expect there to be freedom. That's not the way this works. You need what's called checks and balances. And when Congress makes a decision, it's the Supreme Court that can override that decision. And then you've got the president's decisions that can be checked by the Supreme Court. Congress's decisions can sometimes be checked by the president, vice versa. Congress can overthrow a decision made by, not necessarily overthrow, but change a decision by the Supreme Court by making a law against that. So there are all sorts of mechanisms here at place in order to ensure that there is a balance of power. And what he's saying would not do that. It would actually create the opposite effect and ensure that we fall very quickly into tyranny. So it's quite ridiculous. And you'll see here that he's talking about replace the two-party system with a multi-party democracy. We already know that doesn't work. How do we know? Because people have tried it. Expand the House of Representatives, implement proportional representation and ranked choice voting in all elections, and abolish the Senate. So, all of that is basically saying they want all the power to be in the House of Representatives. Well, it's easier, in a lot of ways for Democrats to get power in the House of Representatives because of these like highly populated states, and they attract a lot of young people, certainly, and young people tend to be Democrats. So there's a lot going on here, and I really encourage you to go and watch that video with this man, because in it there's a caller who calls in who is an immigrant, okay, a legal immigrant, someone who went through the process, and this person came from a socialist country, and talks about, quote, she says, socialism is the worst thing that can exist in the world. It leads to misery and death, end quote. And one of the reasons why people, especially young people, are so gullible to believe, that socialism works. And I'm not saying this is not something that a lot of people believe. When you're young, this is something that's very attractive. But it's through education that you learn the consequences of socialism. And you also learn why America does not institute socialism, why they institute capitalism, because it provides for a much freer society. You can do anything you want in America. You can earn however much you want. You can achieve whatever you want. And in socialist society, that's not the way things work. And it is the opposite of freedom in many ways. And I know that it's enticing to a lot of people. You don't like hearing that, but you have got to do the work in order to understand why this system does not work. One of the reasons I think conservatives have a lot to do with this problem I'm about to address. Okay. Conservatives, really gave the public education system up to progressives. And one of the ways in which they did that was by sending their own children to private schools. I don't have an issue with private schools. I was in education for 10 years before I became a lawyer. And private schools are amazing, but 90% of students go to public schools. And so if you give all those people up to progressives, this is the kind of foolishness that they're going to teach them. And so our students are not learning history. We know they're not even learning how to read because of the test scores that we're getting back, now. And most of them don't understand history. They don't understand the basics of why America was created the way it is. And so many people who are just avidly against America right now don't understand the magic that has made this country great. And part of that magic is capitalism. Part of that magic is this separation of power, this 3 branches of government, these sort of constitutional rights that are promised to us, they work and they continue on because of these three branches of government. China promises their citizens freedom of speech and freedom of religion too, but it doesn't happen. Why? Because there are no checks and balances in China. It's a dictatorship, and whatever that person wants to do, that's what happens. The court rules, based on what the dictatorship wants. And whenever you concentrate all the powers into one branch, that's what you get. No freedom. And so what these people are saying is insane. Okay. It's not going to lead to more freedom. It's not going to lead to any benefits. And if you want to know, what socialism does to a country, you need to examine Venezuela. All right. Now, when I was defending Christians in public schools, as a religious liberty lawyer, which I did for like 6 or 7 years, I often defended, teachers and students in public schools. And I worked with a guy who would sometimes say, and I thought a little bit arrogantly, like, why would anyone even send their kids to public schools? Well, a lot of people don't have a choice. Everybody can't pay for private schools. I was blessed enough to go to magnet schools, but those schools are usually, you get admitted to those schools by applying, which is what I had to do. Sometimes there's lotteries. So everyone doesn't have the opportunity. Magnet schools are technically public, but they're great. And so sometimes kids have to go to public schools. But, this is why conservatives have to care about what goes on in public schools, because 90% of the voting bloc comes from these schools. Only 10% of kids are going to private schools. And so when I hear conservatives ask, like, why, how come so many of these young people believe this? Because they were going to public schools, and this is what they teach them. First of all, a lot of these young people lack critical thinking skills. They believe anything you tell them. And this is not, me trying to be disrespectful to young people, because, I had a boss once that said, when you're young, you're not a Democrat, you don't have a heart. And when you're old, if you're not a Republican, you don't have a brain. I don't necessarily agree with that completely, but I understand what he's saying. When you're young, there are a lot of principles that Democrats subscribe to that seem very compassionate, but they're not necessarily practical, and they don't always lead to the consequences that you think they will. And when you become older, you realize that. And so there's a little bit of truth to that comment, although I'm acknowledging that it's not completely accurate. But not to mention, these Democratic Socialists are not, really Democrats. To be honest with you, they're really communists, but that's a whole different story. But the reason why young people cannot spot this is because they haven't been educated to spot it. If you are educated in history, if you're able to look at what's happened around the world, you'll see that, this type of economic system is very oppressive. It may seem really great, but it isn't. And it takes education to figure that out, because when you first hear it, it sounds great, but it ain't great. All right. Now, let's look at something else. So I, having practiced in the state of Texas, I litigate all across the country because I'm a federal litigator. And a lot of people are surprised when I tell them that no matter where you are, you're going to have like constitutional violations, limitations on freedom of speech and religious liberty, which are just odious to the Constitution. But they happen even in Texas. And here's an example. The Fort Worth police recently admonished some street preachers at a gay pride event, telling them that they were going to be cited and ticketed for offensive speech. And I want you to see this clip of the chief now responding to what happened that day.
Is offended by your talking, then we have a problem.
I sat down with Fort Worth Police Chief Eddie Garcia to ask about this and the backlash his department faces over bias concerns and First Amendment rights.
The biggest issue I think that I have is just the conversations and the way that we were describing what is lawful, what isn't lawful.
In the video, now viral, veteran officer Sarah Stockner threatened to write tickets to street preacher David Grisham protesting outside Pride Fest.
Wait, you're going to ticket us for offensive speech?
Yes, absolutely.
Are you serious?
Speech.
You're going to cite us for
Yes, it's
offensive
called disorderly
speech?
conduct.
Whoa.
No,
Disorderly.
When we're right, we're right. And when we're wrong, we're wrong. And there certainly was a better way to have that communication. And we were wrong in the manner in which we communicated that. Certainly.
And I'm gonna let him.
We're going to take accountability for it.
And here's what Garcia says accountability looks like. First Amendment rights training is now underway across the department.
All right. So I'm actually really familiar with these kinds of issues because as a constitutional lawyer and religious liberty litigator, there were times when we would defend street preachers. And particularly when I first started working as a constitutional lawyer, we would have to write letters for street preachers in anticipation of these kinds of confrontations. So we would write these letters so that the street preachers could hand them to an officer like this woman and say, and the letters would say, here's an outline on the First Amendment. Here's what you can do, and here's what you can't do. And certainly restricting someone for offensive speech is something you cannot do. That is not allowed under the free speech clause. And this happens a lot at Pride events where, people don't want to hear you talking about the Bible or telling them that what they want or what they believe isn't biblical. And I don't know why, because if you don't believe in the Bible, then what do you care what they're saying? Just keep going on with your business. But one of the core tenets of living in America is that you are allowed to say these kinds of things. You are allowed to express yourself. And unfortunately, sometimes you have very ignorant people in law enforcement that will try to squelch that constitutional right, because a lot of people think that just because a lot of people are complaining, I don't like that guy, he's offending me, I don't think he should be able to say that. A lot of police officers think that they can just go up and stop you from speaking. And that is not what free speech means. You are allowed to say things that people don't like. You're not allowed to threaten them or incite violence. There's limitations to free speech, but offense is certainly not a limitation. And it really shouldn't be, because otherwise you really couldn't say very much, could you? Because there are many things that people will find offensive. And so this is one of the chief cornerstones of living in America. And this issue really combines two constitutional clauses, the free speech clause and the free exercise clause, because these street preachers are driven by their religious convictions. And so that's why they're preaching and doing what they're doing. But street preachers have it rough. I can tell you that. I've represented a lot of them, and they face this kind of thing all the time because a lot of police officers do not understand the Constitution. And that's sad. I mean, this is Texas. And I'm sure many of you have seen some of the things going on in the UK right now. In Australia, these are places that are supposed to be democracies, and people are getting arrested and thrown in prison for posting stuff that other people don't like or that other people find offensive. Once you go down that road, you can believe that there will be no freedom left after that. Because if you can police what people believe, you can police conscience, you can police speech, then everything else is going to be taken from you too. Those things are chief cornerstones of freedom. And if the government can tell you what to believe and what to say, then they're going to control everything in your life. That's the way it goes. And that's why this is so dangerous, and it's something that we really need to pay attention to. But there's another thing that I think is really interesting about all of these things that I've just talked about. And that is why people can't tolerate dissent. Why is it that some people, and particularly the Democrats right now on the left, that they don't like hearing things they disagree with, and they can become pretty violent and oppressive, but certainly violent in some instances, i.e. see Charlie Kirk. And I think the reason for that is when you worship your feelings, okay? The Democratic Party has removed God from its platform, and when God is not the standard, when you're not looking back to God-given rights, inalienable rights, which is part of the sort of foundation for the establishment of America, all right? The Declaration of Independence talks about rights that God has given us, that no man should be able to interfere with, and the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which in those rights, we have enshrined that the free speech and the freedom of conscience and all of the things that America wanted to champion in order to escape, being controlled by another country and having a system that tells you where to worship and what to say, and saying that this is against God's laws. All of those things are central to understand that God is sovereign, that he's the one who decides what our rights should be. And I think once the Democrats remove God from the platform, you got to worship something. Something is going to fill that vacuum. And for the Democrats right now, it's feelings. Feelings are the measure of everything. And if you make someone feel bad, the Democrats want to punish that, particularly the liberals. Not all of them. I think there are many Democrats that still understand this situation and see what's going on as a problem. But it's certainly prevalent on that side that they don't like dissent. They don't like being told things they don't like. And it's unfortunate because that is one of the things that makes this country so great, is that people can say what they want. They can believe what they want. And I think when Democrats removed God from their platform and they started sort of openly worshiping feelings, this is sort of a natural progression of that. When you worship your feelings, you don't want anyone making you feel bad. And that's just the way life is. Like, your feelings are not supposed to control you. They're not supposed to rule you. Okay? The Bible says that the heart is deceitful above all things. And you have to learn some self-control. And sometimes your feelings lie to you. Sometimes they tell you things that aren't true. And that doesn't mean that everything conservatives or Republicans are saying or doing is right. What I'm saying is the idea that feelings are the God is problematic. And that's one of the reasons why, we are where we are right now with the division in the country. So we need to take some time to check our own hearts and make sure that we are controlled as kingdom witnesses, as people who love Jesus Christ, that we are being governed by God's standards, by God's laws, and not our feelings, because our feelings are not going to always lead us down the right path. And certainly if we establish a country based on policy and legislation that is surrounded by or controlled by people's feelings, we're going to fall very quickly into tyranny, and we will no longer have a free society. You cannot govern based on feelings, because people won't be free to do anything in that case. Anyway, thanks for joining me today. See you next time.